By the end of this video, you'll understand how an ordinary place, designed to feel routine and harmless, quietly exposed a belief that German women were taught to trust during World War II. At the time, many women believed these facilities existed for hygiene, order, and efficiency. That belief was reinforced by authority, repetition, and the assumption that such basic spaces had no reason to deceive. But when women finally entered one of these rooms themselves, something didn't align with what they had been told. And in that moment, without announcements or warnings, the official explanation could no longer hold. This is the story of how a single, everyday experience revealed what propaganda had worked hard to conceal. To understand why this moment mattered, it's important to understand the belief itself and why it felt reasonable. During World War II, the Nazi state emphasized order, cleanliness, and efficiency as core values of society. These ideas were presented not only as practical necessities, but as signs of discipline and control in a world defined by disruption. Cleanliness suggested stability. Routine suggested normalcy. Order suggested safety. Women were expected to uphold these values in daily life. They were encouraged to trust systems that promised protection and structure, especially during a period when uncertainty was constant. Instructions came from institutions that had already embedded themselves into everyday routines: workplaces, housing authorities, transport systems, and public facilities. Communal washrooms and showers fit naturally into this framework. They were framed as functional spaces meant to preserve hygiene and dignity. Their purpose appeared straightforward, even reassuring. There was nothing about them that invited suspicion. The belief was simple. These were ordinary facilities doing an ordinary job. This belief did not rely on threats or force. It relied on familiarity. Showering was a normal act. Cleanliness was encouraged and rewarded. The explanations aligned with what people already knew and expected. And in wartime, routine offered psychological relief. Believing that some parts of life remained predictable helped people cope. Authority reinforced this sense of safety. Instructions were issued calmly. Procedures were standardized. There was no obvious contradiction between what women were told and what they expected to experience. Trusting these explanations was not framed as obedience. It was framed as common sense. And because the belief fit so neatly into daily life, it went largely unquestioned. There was no single early moment that demanded doubt. No warnings were posted. No explanations appeared inconsistent. The environment itself encouraged acceptance. These spaces looked and felt like other facilities women had used before: utilitarian, controlled, and unremarkable. In a time when questioning authority could carry consequences, the lack of visible danger mattered. Silence became reassurance. Familiarity became proof. Women entered these spaces expecting nothing more than what they had been told. And for a time, that expectation remained intact. Until the experience itself introduced a contradiction that could not be explained away. To understand why the belief endured, it's necessary to understand how authority functioned in wartime Germany. By the early 1940s, the Nazi state had positioned itself as the primary source of order in a society under constant strain. Information, logistics, housing, labor, and public services were all increasingly centralized. Instructions did not arrive as suggestions. They arrived as procedures, standardized, repeated, and normalized. When guidance came from official channels, it carried the assumption of legitimacy. Most civilians were not in a position to independently verify what they were told. They relied on the state not because of blind faith alone, but because alternatives were limited or dangerous. Facilities such as communal showers were administered as part of this broader system. They were introduced and maintained through the same bureaucratic language as other public services. Their existence was explained with the same calm efficiency as rationing schedules or housing assignments. Nothing about these instructions suggested deception. They were framed as practical solutions to wartime conditions, and because they came from authority, they were rarely questioned. Social expectations played an equally important role. Women in wartime Germany were expected to demonstrate discipline, composure, and reliability. They were encouraged to support the war effort by maintaining order in daily life, managing households, and following instructions that promised efficiency and cleanliness. Questioning procedures was not framed as critical thinking. It was framed as disruption. In many cases, silence was rewarded more than curiosity. Compliance signaled maturity, responsibility, and alignment with social norms. This did not require overt coercion. It worked because the expectations were internalized. When women entered public facilities, they did so with the assumption that the system had already accounted for their safety. The belief that such spaces were benign aligned with their social role, to trust, to comply, and to endure. Doubt, if it arose, was often suppressed, not because it was disproven, but because it felt inappropriate. Wartime life imposed constant psychological pressure. Air raids, shortages, uncertainty, and loss were part of daily experience. In this environment, routine became a form of survival. Believing that some aspects of life remained predictable, cleanliness, schedules, basic services, offered emotional relief. It allowed people to compartmentalize fear. Ordinary activities provided the illusion of stability. Shower facilities in particular symbolized normalcy. Hygiene suggested health. Order suggested care. The belief that these spaces existed for benign purposes helped maintain a sense of continuity with pre-war life. Challenging that belief would have meant confronting a more frightening possibility. And for many, that was a psychological cost they were not prepared to pay. Importantly, disbelief carried risks. Questioning official explanations could attract attention. Asking the wrong questions could be interpreted as defiance. In a system where surveillance and denunciation were real concerns, discretion mattered. Even when doubts surfaced privately, they were often left unspoken. Without shared confirmation, uncertainty remained isolated. And isolated doubt is easier to dismiss. In the absence of open discussion, the belief sustained itself. Not because it was repeatedly proven true, but because the consequences of challenging it were unclear and potentially severe. Taken together, these factors created a powerful reinforcement loop. Authority provided reassurance, social norms discouraged questioning, psychological survival favored routine, and fear made silence feel safer than skepticism. The belief did not need to be defended aggressively. It simply needed to exist within a system that made disbelief uncomfortable. As long as nothing directly contradicted it, the belief held. And for a time, nothing did. Beliefs rarely collapse all at once. They weaken at the edges first. In this case, there were details that did not fully align with the explanation women had been given. These details were subtle. Individually, they did not seem significant enough to challenge what authority had already defined as normal. The facilities themselves appeared functional, but certain elements felt unfamiliar. Some aspects of the layout differed from what women expected based on previous experience. The design prioritized control and efficiency over comfort, though this could easily be explained as a wartime necessity. Lighting, spacing, and movement through the space felt unusually constrained. But again, wartime conditions provided an easy justification. Resources were scarce. Privacy was limited. Efficiency mattered more than comfort. Each inconsistency had a plausible explanation. Beyond visual details, there were sensory cues that did not quite match expectations. Sounds echoed differently than expected. The acoustics of the space felt harsher, more industrial. The air felt heavier, more enclosed. These were sensations that registered instinctively, but they did not immediately translate into suspicion. The mind often resolves discomfort by rationalizing it. Women told themselves this was simply a larger facility, or a temporary one, or a design adjusted for wartime use. None of these explanations contradicted what they had been taught. They merely adapted it. Because the belief already existed, new information was filtered through it. Importantly, none of these details directly contradicted the official explanation. They created unease, but not evidence. Discomfort alone is rarely enough to dismantle a belief, especially when authority has already framed expectations. The human tendency is to seek coherence, to make new experiences fit what is already known. In an environment where questioning could carry consequences, ambiguity encouraged silence. Without clear confirmation from others, doubts remained internal, and internal doubts are easily overridden. Another reason these details failed to disrupt the belief was the absence of shared reaction. No one openly voiced concern. No one stopped the process. There were no visible objections. The lack of collective response reinforced the assumption that everything was proceeding as intended. Social silence is powerful. When no one else appears alarmed, the individual assumes their unease is misplaced. In group settings, people often take cues from one another, especially in unfamiliar or stressful situations. In this case, silence did not indicate understanding. It indicated uncertainty without permission to speak. As women moved through these spaces, repetition further dulled suspicion. Once an environment becomes familiar, even unsettling features begin to feel ordinary. The mind adapts. What initially felt strange becomes part of the background. This is how normalization works. Over time, the belief did not require reinforcement. It was maintained by habit. Each uneventful encounter strengthened the assumption that there was nothing to question, until the day when one detail no longer fit. Not because it was louder or more dramatic, but because it directly contradicted the belief in a way that could not be rationalized. Beliefs can absorb a surprising amount of contradiction, but they have limits. As long as inconsistencies remain abstract, they can be explained away. As long as discomfort remains indirect, it can be ignored. The belief survived because no single detail had yet crossed the threshold from unusual to impossible. That threshold had not been reached, but it was approaching. By the time women were directed into the shower room, the belief was still intact. They entered with expectations shaped by everything they had been told, and by everything they had already experienced. The space was meant to serve a practical purpose. It was meant to be temporary, functional, and unremarkable. Nothing about the instructions suggested urgency or danger. There were no warnings, no raised voices, no signs that this experience would differ from what had been promised. The belief did not weaken on the walk-in. It was carried with them into the room. Almost immediately, certain details became difficult to reconcile. The layout did not align with expectations of a communal shower. Elements normally associated with hygiene were absent or altered. The design emphasized containment rather than flow, control rather than use. What women expected to see simply wasn't there. At first, the mind attempted to compensate. Perhaps this was a preliminary area. Perhaps the process had changed. Perhaps the facilities were incomplete. These explanations surfaced instinctively, efforts to preserve coherence. But the longer women remained in the space, the harder those explanations became to maintain. The belief did not collapse because of something dramatic appearing. It collapsed because something essential was missing. At a certain point, the absence itself became impossible to ignore. The lack of expected features fundamental to the purpose they had been told this space served, could no longer be dismissed as inconvenience or wartime adjustment. This was not a matter of discomfort. It was a matter of contradiction. The explanation no longer matched the reality of the room. And once that realization formed, it spread quietly, not through conversation, but through shared recognition. This was not a public confrontation. No one announced what they were realizing. No one needed to. Recognition happens silently when a belief fails all at once. The mind reaches a point where rationalization stops working, where explanations feel forced, where the only remaining conclusion is the one previously avoided. For the women in that room, the belief did not fade gradually. It ended. At this point, the belief could not be restored. There was no alternative explanation that fit both what had been promised and what was now visible. Authority could no longer bridge the gap. Routine could no longer soften the contradiction. This was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected later. The experience itself had rewritten what was possible. Once reality contradicted the belief so directly, trust could not be reestablished through reassurance alone. The belief had done its job for as long as it could. Now it had failed. What followed was not chaos. It was silence. A silence shaped by shock, fear, and the sudden absence of certainty. A silence where understanding arrived before language could. This silence mattered. It marked the precise moment when propaganda lost its power, not because it was argued against, but because experience rendered it irrelevant. The belief collapsed not under pressure, but under exposure. When a belief collapses in an instant, the first consequence is not action. It is disorientation. For the women who experienced this moment, understanding arrived faster than emotion. The mind registered the contradiction before it could process what it meant. Familiar explanations were suddenly unavailable, leaving nothing to replace them. Shock did not appear as panic. It appeared as stillness. This kind of shock is quiet. It immobilizes rather than agitates. The absence of certainty creates a pause where thought struggles to keep pace with reality. What they now understood could not be undone. Ordinarily, fear is accompanied by some form of explanation, an identifiable threat, a clear instruction, a path forward. Here, there was none. No one explained what was happening. No authority intervened to clarify or correct. The system that had previously provided structure offered nothing in return. This absence mattered. Without official acknowledgement, understanding became isolating. Each person carried the realization internally, without confirmation, without reassurance, and without context. Fear intensified not because of what was visible, but because of what was no longer believable. In many cases, awareness does not immediately translate into resistance or escape. Knowing the truth does not always provide options. For those who had just experienced this collapse of belief, the realization brought with it a new burden, knowledge without agency. They now understood something essential, but understanding alone did not offer safety. This imbalance created a deeper sense of vulnerability. The belief had once provided psychological shelter. Its collapse removed that shelter without offering an alternative. One of the most striking consequences was what did not happen next. There was no institutional response, no correction, no acknowledgement that the belief had failed. The system continued operating as though nothing had changed. Procedures remained the same. Instructions remained unaltered. The absence of reaction reinforced a harsh reality. The belief had served its purpose, and its failure did not require explanation. This silence was not accidental. It was structural. By offering no response, the system avoided confrontation with the truth. It relied on shock, fear, and isolation to suppress reaction. After the collapse, behavior did not immediately change, but its meaning did. Where trust had once existed, compliance took its place. Actions continued not because the explanation was believed, but because alternatives felt unreachable. The relationship between individuals and authority shifted subtly but permanently. What had once been accepted now felt imposed. This distinction matters. Belief invites cooperation. Compliance enforces submission. The moment the belief collapsed, the system lost something it could not easily replace. Another immediate consequence was isolation. Without open discussion, each person assumed they were alone in their understanding. Silence created the illusion that realization was individual rather than shared. This fragmentation prevented collective response. When belief collapses privately, it fractures potential resistance. Each person processes the truth in isolation, unsure who else sees what they see. The system depended on this fragmentation, and in that moment, it worked. The collapse of the belief revealed something important about how it had been built in the first place. The explanation women were given did not rely on elaborate lies or constant reinforcement. It relied on simplicity. The belief was effective because it aligned with ordinary expectations. Cleanliness, routine, and order were already familiar concepts. The system did not need to invent new ideas. It only needed to redirect existing ones. By embedding the belief into everyday activities, propaganda became indistinguishable from normal life. The explanation felt natural because it did not demand emotional investment. It asked only for acceptance, and acceptance, once normalized, rarely feels like submission. What ultimately dismantled the belief was not argument, evidence, or dissent. It was direct experience. As long as the belief existed at a distance, explained by authority and supported by routine, it could survive inconsistencies. But once individuals encountered a reality that directly contradicted what they had been told, the belief lost its ability to adapt. No revised explanation could reconcile what had been promised with what was observed. This reveals a fundamental limitation of propaganda. It depends on separation between narrative and experience. When that separation disappears, belief becomes unsustainable. Another revelation lay in the choice of setting. The belief collapsed not in a courtroom, a battlefield, or a public square, but in an ordinary space, a place associated with routine rather than danger. This was not accidental. Ordinary spaces disarm suspicion. They lower defenses. They encourage compliance through familiarity. By using environments that felt mundane, the system minimized resistance. People do not expect deception in places designed for everyday use. The moment that expectation failed, the shock was not only about the truth itself, but about where it was discovered. The collapse also revealed why the belief had endured for so long. It did not rely on constant enforcement. It relied on psychological economy. Accepting the explanation required less effort than questioning it. Doubt demanded emotional energy, social risk, and mental strain. Belief, in this context, was efficient. As long as daily life continued without overt disruption, the belief required no maintenance. It persisted through inertia. Only when experience disrupted that inertia did collapse become unavoidable. From a systemic perspective, the belief achieved its purpose. It delayed suspicion. It reduced resistance. It managed behavior without constant force. But the collapse revealed the cost. Once trust was broken, it could not be easily restored. Compliance might continue, but belief could not. The system traded long-term legitimacy for short-term control. That trade-off became visible only after the belief failed. This moment was not unique because of its scale, but because of its mechanism. Beliefs built on routine are powerful precisely because they feel harmless. They persist until reality interrupts them directly. And when they collapse, they do so quietly, without spectacle, without argument. The story reveals a broader pattern. Belief systems often fail not when they are challenged, but when they are experienced. The truth did not need to be announced. It only needed to be encountered. History rarely pauses to acknowledge when a belief collapses. After this moment, there was no formal reckoning, no public admission that the explanation had failed. Life, as structured by the system, continued forward. Procedures remained in place. Instructions were followed. The machinery of the state did not slow down to account for what individuals now understood. For those who experienced the collapse, the realization did not become a story to be told openly. It became something carried quietly, without language, without confirmation, and without resolution. The world moved on, even as certainty had not. One of the lasting consequences of belief collapse is the absence of correction. The explanation that had been taught was never publicly withdrawn. It was not replaced with a new narrative. Instead, it was simply abandoned, left to dissolve without acknowledgement. This silence allowed the system to avoid responsibility. Without admitting error, it preserved the appearance of control. And without correction, individuals were left to reconcile their understanding alone. In this way, the belief did not end with clarity. It ended with omission. For many, the memory of this moment was not marked by dramatic detail, but by its ordinariness. What lingered was not an image, but a realization that something trusted had failed without warning, that certainty had been manufactured, that routine had been used to disguise intention. These memories did not always take the form of testimony. Often, they surfaced later as hesitation, distrust, or silence, subtle shifts in how authority was perceived. The experience changed how belief was understood, even if it was never spoken aloud. This story matters not because of its scale, but because of its mechanism. It shows how belief systems can operate quietly, without constant reinforcement or visible force. It shows how trust can be built through familiarity rather than persuasion. And it shows how belief collapses, not when it is argued against, but when it encounters reality directly. The collapse did not arrive with warning. It arrived through experience. The shower was never meant to be questioned. That was the point. It was meant to feel ordinary, predictable, safe. And because it did, belief held until it couldn't. When that belief failed, it did so without spectacle, without confrontation, without explanation. It failed quietly. And in that quiet failure, the truth became unavoidable.